are places in New England where the past doesn't just linger, it patrols. Connecticut, specifically, is a landscape built in layers, colonial settlements, industrial grit, and deep ecclesiastical roots that reach back centuries. People often talk about the city on a hill as a metaphor for a perfect society, but if you spend enough time in the older structures of the Nutmeg State, you realize that the hill is crowded, and the city is full of people who never checked out. This is a story about one of those places, a church that has stood for over 150 years, witnessing every birth, wedding, and funeral of its congregation. But it is also a story about a specific kind of entity, the territorial dead. We often think of hauntings as recordings, a phenomenon called the stone tape theory, where emotional events are burned into limestone and oak. But what happens when the energy isn't just a loop? What happens when it's an intelligence that views you as an intruder in its workshop? I was at my old church in Connecticut, a place that felt as familiar as home, but always had its quirks. I was there alone to perform a mundane, necessary task, changing out light fixtures in an upstairs hallway. It was the kind of maintenance work that sustains a building's life, but to something else in that hall, it was a desecration of the shadows. The Boy Scout troop that used the space at night had been complaining for months. They reported the sound of footsteps, steady, heavy, pacing the upstairs corridor when no one else was in the building. I'd heard the stories, of course, but I'd always put them down to the natural settling of an old building or the overactive imaginations of teenagers. That night, the silence of the church was heavy. I had a 6-foot ladder positioned in the center of that upstairs hallway. I had the new fixture resting on the paint step, and I had placed 2 3-inch screws on the very top step, right where I could reach them. I climbed up, my movements deliberate, and reached toward the ceiling to take the glass bowl off the old fixture. The air didn't just get cold, it became focused. As my hands were occupied with the glass, I felt a sharp, distinct poke right in the center of my chest. It wasn't a brush of wind or a muscle twitch. It was a physical displacement, a tactile mediumship event intended to get my attention. Immediately after the poke, the silence was shattered by a metallic cadence. Ding, 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 ding. I looked down. One screw was still on the top step. The other was now rolling around in the glass bowl of the new fixture on the paint step below me. I hadn't shaken the ladder. There was no vibration, no slant that would have caused a heavy metal screw to leap from the top platform and land with a rhythmic triplet in the center of a bowl 2 feet below it. In the study of poltergeists, this is known as a stage 3 manifestation, the intelligent movement of objects. But the rhythm was what made my blood run cold. 2 beats, followed by a rapid-fire triplet. It was a signal. It was a performance. Most people would have bolted, but I've had encounters before, just not here. I felt a surge of grounded irritation, the kind of psychological resilience that often breaks the fear loop spirits rely on. I looked into the empty hallway and told it to scram. I told it I was busy. I finished that fixture without another sound, but the angry man was just getting started. I moved to the room next door to change some fluorescent tubes. To keep my eyes adjusted and the work safe, I kept the overhead lights off, relying on the ambient glow from the hallway. As I engaged with the first fixture, the light adjacent to it, an entirely separate circuit, flashed on and off 3 or 4 times. This is what researchers call electromagnetic interference, or EMI. Spirits are believed to harness the energy within electrical ballasts to communicate or disrupt. But this wasn't random. As I moved to the second fixture, then a third, the light nearest to my hands would flash every single time. The entity was shadowing me. It was monitoring my progress, countering my attempt to bring permanent light to the room with its own jarring stroboscopic strobe. Science tells us that flickering lights at specific frequencies can induce altered states of consciousness or even visual hallucinations. It was as if the entity was trying to psychologically destabilize me, to make me feel the nausea and disorientation that would force any sane person to leave. I didn't leave. I stood my ground, shouted, "Knock it off," and finished the room. But then came the kitchen. I was working with only a headlamp now, the narrow beam cutting through the pitch-black space. As I removed the acrylic wrap from a ceiling fixture and set it on the counter, I saw it. A dark figure was poking its head into the doorway from the auditorium. In the dim peripheral light, its features were stylized, high contrast, and deeply unsettling. It had two bright white dots for eyes and a thin white line for a mouth. It was the Uncanny Valley in physical form, human enough to be recognizable, but distorted enough to trigger a primal fight or flight response. It wasn't a residual haunting. It wasn't a recording of a past event. It was an observer. It stood there for 20 seconds, staring at me with those white, beady eyes. I glared back. I told it to get out of my church. It vanished, only to return a minute later. At that point, I shifted my tactics. I stopped being irritated and started being authoritative. I stood on the floor of that kitchen, staring down the doorway, and called on the archangels to remove it. The use of religious authority, invoking higher spiritual planes, is a protocol used for centuries to clear oppressive spirits. After a minute of intense silence, the figure faded. It was gone. I finished the job, packed my tools, and headed for the back room to drop off my gear. I opened the door thinking I was finally done with the night when I was hit with a stiff, acrid whiff of cigar smoke right in my nose. The smell of tobacco in a sacred space is a deliberate act of defiance. In Connecticut, the history of the cigar is deep. Hartford was once the region's cigar-making capital, and iconic figures like Mark Twain were famous for the constant haze that followed them even in life. But in this church, it was a parting shot. It was the angry man asserting that even if I had finished the lights, he still held the territory. Months later, a friend with mediumistic abilities came through that same upstairs hallway. They didn't know the story of the screws or the flashing lights, but as they stepped into that space, they stopped dead. "There is an angry man up here," they said, "and he doesn't want anyone in his space." The diagnosis was chillingly accurate. It pointed toward the sexton theory, the idea that a former caretaker, a man whose identity was tied to the physical upkeep and proprietary control of the building, was still making his rounds. To a sexton from the 19th century, a modern maintenance worker is an interloper, a person using unknown tools to alter a space that he spent a lifetime protecting. But the story took an even darker turn when I spoke to my brother. He recounted his own experiences from the early 2000s when we were kids staying at our grandparents' house. He described being 6 years old, paralyzed in a hallway, unable to scream or move. From a guest room at the end of the hall, a figure would emerge, impossibly tall, touching the ceiling, and the features he described matched the church entity with terrifying precision: beady eyes and a stretched, unnatural smile. My brother told me about the night he was jolted awake because something hit him in the head so hard that he fell off the bed, leaving a tennis ball-sized bump. He told me about the voice he heard from outside his window: "Let me in. I can't come in unless you let me in." It's a classic trope of entities that require a psychic opening to influence a target. But in the church, I had given it no such permission. I had met it with irritation, not fear, and so it was limited to pokes and peeking. This realization raises a haunting question. Is the angry man tied to the church, or is he a lineage attachment that has followed our family through the decades? Or is he a regional archetype, a persistent New England legend that has coalesced into a physical presence in the thin atmosphere of our oldest buildings? As you walk through the historic corridors of Connecticut, remember that the silence is rarely empty. The footsteps heard by the Boy Scouts are the footsteps of a man who hasn't realized his shift ended a century ago. He is still there, guarding his hallways, waiting for the next intruder to climb a ladder into his domain. He is the angry man of the ecclesiastical corridor, and in his space, the lights never stay on for long. I left the church that night, and I haven't been back to that hallway since. But sometimes, when I'm in an old building and the lights begin to flicker in sequence, I don't think about the wiring. I think about the white dots for eyes. I think about the thin white line for a mouth, and I wait for the smell of cigar smoke to tell me that I'm not alone. The city on the hill is still watching, and it doesn't like what we've done with the place. Summary of case evidence and references. Boy Scout troop reports. Footsteps in an upstairs hallway. Tactile interaction, sharp poke in the center of the chest. Auditory signaling, ding 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 of a screw in a glass fixture. Electrical manipulation, sequential flashing of fluorescent light fixtures. Visual apparition, shadow figure with 2 white dots for eyes and a thin white line for a mouth. Olfactory manifestation, stiff whiff of cigar smoke upon exiting. Professional diagnosis, sensitivity assessment of an angry man who is territorial of the space. Parallel familial account, brother's childhood trauma with an identical tall figure.